From Social Prosperity Partners, this is Community Catalysts.
Children in public schools are being educated, yes. They're being educated in all the topics they need to be educated in. But the fact that they're in public means they're also being educated in how to live in and maintain a democracy.
Welcome to Community Catalysts. I'm your host, Matt Lehrman. Public education is one of the clearest places where democracy either lives up to its promise or falls short. It's where communities decide in very practical terms who belongs, who gets access, and whether opportunity is real. And in many places right now, that promise feels strained. Enrollment is competitive, funding is tight, families have more choices than ever, and trust cannot be assumed. This podcast is for leaders who understand that serving locally means stepping into that reality with steadiness and conviction. My guest today is Jennifer Hall Lee, a member of the Pasadena Unified School Board in California. She serves in a district with more private schools per capita than anywhere else in the nation, which means public education can't assume it's the default. It has to be chosen. It has to be defended. Jennifer ran for office because she believes deeply in public schools, and that belief is not merely theoretical for her. I'm especially interested in learning how a formative chapter in her family's history has shaped the convictions she brings to public office today. Jennifer Hall Lee, welcome to Community Catalysts.
Hi, Matt. Happy to be here.
Good to see you. So, look, for many listeners who don't know Pasadena Unified, help us understand the context of where you're serving. It's a community with a lot of educational choice.
Yes, we have the highest number of private schools per capita in the nation. We are also the first school district west of the Mississippi to be court-ordered to integrate in 1970. And so we have a deep history, an interesting history. There's a lot of conflict, but there's also a lot of pride in that. I sometimes say we're on the front lines of what's happening in public education in the United States today.
What do you mean by on the front lines?
Well, these days, since the late 90s, when charter schools started being created, public schools had to start competing. That's not how charter schools kind of in theory started, but it's how they started to progress. And once public schools have to compete with privately run schools, or, charters are publicly funded, but they run themselves. So they choose their trustees. Trustees of public schools are democratically elected. We are held accountable by the people. But when you have to compete with a privately run organization for education, now you are a public institution, a public entity competing in the private space. We have public spaces in our country and private spaces. We have businesses and we have public institutions or democratic institutions. And when those two lines start to blur, the people that usually start to lose are the people in the private spaces because we are government funded.
Jennifer, when you think about that landscape, what does it demand of a school board member that might be different from districts where public education can be more simply assumed?
So, the role of that school board member in this type of environment is complex, and sometimes things are they're difficult to explain. And it kind of brings me into special education, because when the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, IDEA, was approved by Congress in 1975, they promised to pay public education up to 40% of our special education costs, right? So this was the first time that people with special needs had a right to be in public education. So that's a huge shift for public education. But what has happened over these many, decades is that we've never been fully funded. That 40% has never been reached.
Really? It's never been reached?
No. Oh, no. It's down around 13% or so. And so what happens is, these are difficult things to talk about, but you never want to blame people for something. And this is where I think our language and our thoughts have to get really precise. We don't have enough money for public education in the United States. That's the bottom line. So, in many districts throughout California, and I'll just stay with my state, we are funding our special education costs from the general fund. Now, me just saying that shows a sort of like a pitting of one area against another, and that's not what we do. We are all general education. Every single human being, we are general ed. And services are on a spectrum. We all have different needs. So as we promise to educate every child and we don't have enough money, that money starts to get moved around. We have to make cuts. And sometimes we'll have deficits, structural deficits. So I do know that some districts are moving $90 million a year out of the general fund to pay for special education services. Some are paying $50 million, but these deficits exist. We have to educate every single child. Every single child has the right to a free and in-person education.
Jennifer, you mentioned the IDEA. And as we were preparing for our conversation today, you shared that a formative chapter in your family's history profoundly shaped how you think about public education and dignity and accountability. I don't want to tell the story. Can I ask you to tell the story of what that family background is and how that informs how you approach your board leadership today?
Sure. My mother was a social worker. We're from Staten Island, New York. My father was a police officer. In 1970, my parents separated, and my mother took a job at Willowbrook State School for the disabled. It's on Staten Island because she had been working in Manhattan and she just wanted to be closer. And Willowbrook was probably the largest institution of its kind. So before 1975, before IDEA, we routinely institutionalized people with special needs in the United States. If a child was born with Down syndrome or another disability, very commonly doctors would say, well, you have to put them in an institution. And sometimes those institutions would say, oh, we're going to educate your child. That didn't really happen because Willowbrook was what is known as a total institution. You could not just walk in and out. If you had a child there, if you placed a child there, you couldn't just say, oh, I think I'm going to go see my kid today, and it's a Thursday. You have to call, make an appointment. They have the child out in the lobby for you. So my mom started working there, and she said that on her first day, she thought, I never should have come here. And there was a young woman who was also on her first day, and the young woman was really excited about working with babies. And my mom had the baby building also. And later that day, she saw the young woman who had been so exuberant in the morning. And by the end of the day, the woman looked stricken. Institutionalizing people is not humane. And there were overcrowded conditions. People didn't have clothes. People were being force fed. There was all sorts of abuses. So my mother started to organize parents and to talk with them. They couldn't get to their kids. They didn't know what was going on. She and another social worker started organizing, and then a doctor. My mother's name is Elizabeth Lee. The doctor's name was Mike Wilkins. They worked together to work on exposing the conditions at Willowbrook State School. And they had some trouble. Some people didn't want to take the story, like big groups that we would know today. But the Staten Island Advance did take the story. And it was a young journalist, female, and I think she was in her 20s. And she took it, and it became the front page inside the cages at Willowbrook. And it set off a firestorm. And what happened was Dr. Mike Wilkins knew a young reporter in Manhattan and asked that reporter to come and cover this, what was happening. And the reporter's name was Geraldo Rivera. And that was his first big story. But prior to Geraldo Rivera coming to cover Willowbrook, sort of undercover, my mother and Dr. Mike Wilkins had been fired for going to the newspaper. And parents started protesting. They started demanding that they go inside the wards. Again, it's a total institution. Once you're inside, those doors are locked. So the outcome of this story was the closure of Willowbrook State School, which didn't happen until 1987. There were 6,000 residents there. So if you're talking about shutting down an institution like that, you've got to find places for those people to live. Were their parents alive? Could their parents take care of them? And that takes tremendous amounts of time. And my grandmother also started working at that time. She was very much an activist. Her youngest son, my mother's brother, my uncle, has Down syndrome. But when he was born, the doctor said to my grandparents, you have to put him in Willowbrook. And Willowbrook was in walking distance of my grandparents' house. And they went down there and looked at Willowbrook, and they knew that they couldn't put him in there. So my uncle grew up at home. And when my mother was fired, I ended up living at my grandparents' house with my mother. So I was very close to my grandparents and my uncle. And I watched my grandmother fight for him to have all sorts of activities. She became head of the PTA at the Staten Island Aid, because they had places for people with disabilities, but they were kind of like public money, but privately run. And he was not in public school. There was no law protecting him for that. So she started fighting for group homes and became very active, and eventually was very well known, spoke before the school board, spoke before the City Planning Commission in Manhattan. And she received the Hungerford Award for the Occupational Training Center, which was one of the schools that my uncle went to. And that was unusual for a parent to get that award. Usually it went to teachers and administrators. And she fought for group homes, and they, too much conflict. People did not want it. They did not want people with disabilities in their neighborhoods. And my grandmother was absolutely shocked at the pushback. And it challenged her with her religion. We're a Catholic family.
This wasn't just about education. This was about living with people with disabilities.
Yeah. It's about what we now call inclusion. It was about, where do people have a right to live? And she went to one town meeting that was at a church, I believe, and the people, she came home and said, I've never heard such terrible things that people say about others. She was shocked. And the priest who was there at this town hall, and he never said anything. He didn't challenge them. He didn't say this is unchristlike. And she went home. She wrote a letter to the priest saying, you didn't do your job as a priest. You didn't exhibit any moral authority. You know, these people said terrible things, lies. And she said, I'm never coming back to your church. And he got so upset, he called her. She said it again. She said, you failed as a priest. And after that, I never saw her go to church again, but she always prayed at home. And she's a deeply religious person. So she had her faith, but she lost her faith in the church during that time.
The significance of this was not just for Staten Island or New York. This ended up having national significance, yes?
What happened was deinstitutionalization. That's the word we use. We deinstitutionalized the United States of America. All the institutions started falling away, because now a child with disabilities had every right to go into a public school and to receive services.
So I'm kind of fast forwarding a lot here. Tell me how that experience informs your approach to being on the school board.
You know, it's such a winding road. My background is in the film industry, visual effects, storytelling. And my daughter went to a school here in Altadena, a Pasadena Unified School District school. And it had been considered at that time kind of, maybe low performing, that people use phrases like that. And I walked in to take a tour of it because people were saying, oh, no, you can't put your kid there. And I said, well, let me check it out because it's such a beautiful school. And I walked in. I got married late. I became a mom late. I was very much into my career. There's a lot of us out there. And so here I am. I'm like in my 40s. I've got this kid and I've got to find a school. And I see this school and I take a little tour and I walk into the lobby and I look and the bell had just rung and the kids are streaming out of the classrooms. And I saw the diversity of America in front of me, and I saw children with disabilities. And one child she had disabilities, and she was looking at me as I was standing there just watching the kids. And she had this huge smile on her face. And I knew right then and there, my kid was going to do great in this school because these kids were happy. And so I started working with the school, doing the annual fund, really getting involved. And then I thought, we've got some issues in our town about bad perceptions of public education. We've got this hyper competition with private schools and charter schools. And Pasadena Unified School District is a good school district. I say it's great. And I knew that's the work I wanted to do. So I ran for Altadena Town Council seat. And that seat is a volunteer position.
Mm-hmm.
And it started to coincide with the work on this, being in the school, the middle school. It just started to blend. And I started to educate myself on the connection between our democratic institutions and the health of the country itself and the health of a community. And I thought, I think I should run for the school board trustee because maybe I can reach more people, and we need enrollment. We've got to have enrollment. And I've never wavered on that. And that's a very tricky, not tricky, it's a difficult subject. And I ran and I won. And I'm moving along in the school board, just moving along, learning, figuring it all out. And I talked to our chief academic officer one day, and she was talking to me about my background because I had just been elected. And I mentioned Staten Island and Willowbrook State School. And she stopped and looked at me. She said, "What?" I said, "Well, Willowbrook, and I started to explain Willowbrook. She goes, No, I know what Willowbrook is. I studied it for my dissertation." And I said, "Well, my mom was the whistleblower." And she just was shocked. Like here was living history right in front of her. And I said, "Well, I've been in one of the wards. My mother brought me inside one of the wards at Willowbrook." And she looked at me and she said, and I could see it in her eyes. I could see her thinking, I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing because I was 9 years old, but she wanted me to see it. And I walked inside, and when she opened the doors of that institution, of this ward, the smell came out at me. And I knew that smell, and the only place I knew it from was the Staten Island Zoo. And we walked in, and I could see all these men, it was a men's ward, rocking back and forth on just benches, lonely, just sounds. And my mother had talked to someone, and she instructed me to stand where I was standing and not to move. And I just observed it. Maybe that's early documentary filmmaking training. I just observed. And then we walked out. And that has never left me at that. It's like a film like a film clip in my head that I can access when I hear about things about like forced institutions, sort of historical things that happen and things that are happening now. I refer to that.
Jennifer, you were a witness to that, and now you can speak to others about what it means to be a witness.
It's funny that you say the word witness. I've never used that phrase, but yes, I was a witness. It was like you're sort of dropped into another world, not to interact, but to watch and observe and learn. And I think that has really inspired me. So what happened with the chief academic officer is the head of the special education department asked me if I would speak to the special education department at their welcome back event. It was an August event. Maybe do a little PowerPoint about your family and tell the story of your experiences with your family and the activism at Willowbrook. And I said, yeah, sure, I can do that. And I put this PowerPoint together, and it was like a couple of hundred people. And I started to tell the story. And the story was very easy to tell. It's like the history is so close to me. And people were really blown away. And one young woman said, "I'm so glad you told me this story because I have a client who's in his 70s and he can't write his name. And I keep asking people, but where did he go to school? Where did he go to school? And they kept telling me he was in an institution. And I didn't really know what they meant, but now I know.
Am I reading a little bit too much between the lines for you? Or is it possible that you're telling the story, even for something that you observed as a 9-year-old, that you're passing on something tangible and vivid that's actually going to help future generations understand the significance of what that history is about?
Yeah. The presence of children in K through 12 education, the presence of children in TK through 12 education that is as diverse as it is now, including children with disabilities, really has come about in this country since the 60s and 70s. So the presence of people with special needs in our schools now is new. And we're still hooked onto IDEA, which has changed, and we have ADA now, and things have come along, but not being fully funded. And this is something I think about a bit. IDEA not being fully funded is a throwback to prejudices that existed before IDEA. There is no reason that shouldn't be fully funded. Where I've come to as a person who placed a child in public school and who works with women's rights, human rights. So the rights of women are part of a democracy. When democracies start to fall apart, women's rights kind of go first. It's just the way it's always been. And that's, a really heavy thing to think about. Public education, to me personally, and I use certain words here, it's almost like that underpinning of the entire democracy. It's where we, as little children at 4 or 5 years old, we step into the school and we see the diversity of our community, because the kids are coming from different parts of a district and they're all coming into one place. That's where you learn to get along with people that don't have your same background, and maybe also to be interested in their background, because that's how we learn to understand the differences in Americans as we become adults, and you have to start dealing with making decisions about housing, Social Security, immigration, healthcare. All of that is learned at a very young age. And, I made a statement the other night in a board meeting. Actually, it was a retreat we had. And we were talking about the role of the trustee and the role on the governance team, because a trustee is a part of a team that works with the superintendent. Trustees can hire and fire a superintendent, but it's sort of a weird little spot in that we also work with them as a team. And that's where the community comes into the business part, and we work together. Children in public schools are being educated, yes. They're being educated in all the topics they need to be educated in. But the fact that they're in public means they're also being educated in how to live in and maintain a democracy. Every second of every day, they are in that public school. They're learning it. I cannot say the same for people in private schools or even charter schools. And the reason is that charter schools may be publicly funded, but they're privately run. Public school is publicly funded, publicly run through elected representatives.
Jennifer, one of the reasons that I was so interested to talk to you is that not only do you have this really singular family history and perspective, and of course your own local service from the town council to the school board, but I also know that you've done work internationally. I'm really interested in asking you to share what that is and what perspective you bring to your local leadership from having worked with women's rights leaders in Pakistan.
Yeah. I made a film on the women's liberation movement here in the United States. There was a little clip online, like years ago, for a conference that I had shown part of the film. And a teacher at the Islamic University in Islamabad wrote to me and said, I think some of the teachers here at the university would be very interested in this film. So she connected me with the professor, and the professor said, why don't you come here? I'll put you up. We'll feed you. You have to pay for your own flight and show your film to us. And I'm like, okay. And I went by myself to Islamabad and met these women. And it was an amazing experience. They were asking these scholarly questions about Betty Friedan and the work of the women's liberation movement. And I'm looking and I'm like, wow, they're really studying this. And it was this incredible experience. And also, as an independent filmmaker, there were like 300 women in the audience. And that's a really tough number to get when you're an independent filmmaker. So I was pretty excited.
And you're saying not just studying this, they were hungry for this.
They were hungry for it. And I was a little nervous about going there because there was like a plaque on the hallway and it talked about the people who had died in a bomb blast. I asked the professor, I said, what is this? And they said, oh, well, we had a terrorist attack and students were killed. And I said, why here? She said, because we educate women. And this was a gender segregated school. So you had a women's campus called the female campus. Took a picture of that.
And this is what, 2013, right?
Yeah, it's around that time. Yeah, it was that time. Or 14, I can't remember. But I was on the female campus, gender segregation. And it was like, this is kind of what it was like in the United States, that there was a time when if you were a straight A student in your high school and you applied to get for a grant or something, they could say to you, or a scholarship, a school could say to you, well, you're perfect, you're wonderful, but we have all the women we want in this class. And you had no legal recourse to change that. You had nothing. So that's why you had a lot of women who were straight A students or maybe had higher ed, and they were secretaries because they could get a job doing that. So the women's liberation movement changed so much in our country. And that's what I wanted to talk about in this film that I made and then was showing in Pakistan. I've been back 3 times. They've come here and we worked together. The last time I was there for a month. They took me up to the mountains, up near like Afghanistan, way down to the ocean. And I interviewed women on feminism, patriarchy, their women's liberation movement, which was in the early 80s, and their thoughts for the future. And I took photographs and I did film clips, and they were printed, the photographs were printed on fabric by women at a group called Behbud, Behbud, the oldest organization that helps women do sewing and piecework and garment design and construction. They've been around since the 60s. They offered to print on fabric. And then the women from the Islamic University were talking and they said, well, why don't they sew some borders with some of the fabric? So they're a sustainable group, organization. So the frames of the portraits that are printed on fabric are fabric frames from pieces of garments that were basically dropped on the floor. They picked them up and they did color coordination. Beautiful, beautiful work. So it truly was a collaborative effort. And it's called Women Beyond Borders, The Lives of Pakistani Women. And it showed in Islamabad and it showed here at Pasadena City College in Pasadena.
Is it available for streaming somewhere?
It's an exhibit. So on my website, you can see the images.
Excellent. So what do you take from that experience that is meaningful to you in your role as a school board member today?
It's interesting. When I was in Pakistan doing these interviews, I wanted to talk about people, where are the lesbians? So, because lesbians were a huge part of the women's movement in the United States. And they were really part of that initial push for the gay rights movement. And women at the university said to me, well, you can ask people, but you shouldn't use the word lesbian. And I said, really? And they said, no. And I said, well, can I use the word gay? They said, you can use the word gay, but you can't use lesbian. that it would create some tensions if I used the word lesbian. And I talked about it a little bit, but I've really thought about that for a while. And my interpretation of that is that when women, lesbian women, are women and women together, they've pushed away the male patriarchal system. They've gone off the grid of patriarchy. When you're gay, gay is either male or female. It's more of a broad term. Lesbian is very specific. So any sort of a threat around the word lesbian in another country or even here really points to being female. And we're struggling with that today. The main frame of our culture is male. When I was growing up, they would say, we're all mankind. Now, I know you're a girl and you're a boy, but we're all mankind. So I remember sitting there going, well, why would you even bother saying that? Like it made no sense. And in the women's liberation movement, early theory, scholarly theory from feminists in the 60s, there was one phrase they would use about that phrase, mankind. Girls have to do a mental somersault. They have to say, yes, I'm female and I'm a girl, but I'm mankind. That just makes no logical sense. Where's your sense of self in the world? Am I female, or is female a subset to a male mainframe?
Jennifer, this is the same point that you made earlier in our discussion about special education, that special education is education.
Yes. So is it a subset to a mainframe for students without special needs? In which case, how is that equal? It's not. If we're all general ed, you're perceiving the school or the school system as equality for all. And it's amazing how hard it is to do this. As maybe where we are right now as human beings in the world, that for some reason, sometimes we want to split off and do something else because we think it's better for us. And these are just things that I kind of ponder as to how to fuse back the equality from public school and the issues of special education and not being fully funded point to biases towards people who we perceive to be not like us.
You know, my question was, how do these experiences inform your role as a school board member? And I'm just reflecting on what you're saying, and tell me if this is a fair observation. You've just articulated everything that is intended with the words diversity, equity, and inclusion. And except for just a moment ago when you used the word inclusion, you actually haven't used that vocabulary in the course of this discussion. But I think it's pretty safe to say that that's very much informing how your approach to public leadership is in this moment. True?
Yeah. When I first walked into the middle school in Altadena to place my child there, to take a look at it, because people thought that a lot of people I knew were just like, you shouldn't really go there. I walked in and I saw diversity. I saw inclusion. But it's funny because when I walked in, those words weren't in my head. I think it was a feeling that I had of feeling comfortable because this is my community. And they were all here. And I felt a part of it. There's things in a democracy that maybe we don't have the language for right now that leads us down this democratic path. And language is very important.
We're approaching the end, and I'm going to stay on this point for a moment. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the significance of diversity, equity, inclusion, and what other vocabulary that is under strain right now that you would call into the moment and say, even if we're being careful about how we're using these words, that there are certain core principles that as school board leaders or elected leaders of any kind, that we need to make sure that we are reinforcing and advancing and standing up for in this moment.
When children feel included, when they feel safe, their student achievement is going to rise. You have to feel that before you can act. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is under fire right now, those words. Well, when I was in Pakistan and I was told I couldn't use the word lesbian, it silenced me. I had to think alone what that meant. And I had to remember not to say it. If you're remembering not to say a word, you're going to start not thinking about it. You're going to push it away. And if we don't have inclusion, diversity, and equity in a society, we don't have a democracy. You're going to have a country where people are excluded, pushed aside, or locked up in a closed institution with no rights and no voices. It's a paradox in that they may look at test scores for standardized tests and say, look, they're not hitting the mark. And yet these tests have been under fire since they started by Dewey himself, that they don't accurately measure a person's achievement. So in some ways, our public school system is still kind of back in the 1800s. The school board trustees that concept, a board trustee, head of a school, we run the school, that started in the 1800s, and we're still here. But in some ways, we haven't advanced. We're trying. We keep getting pushed back. And not funding IDEA fully pushes back on public education. It's part of this quest by some to dismantle public education. And the people, the forces that want to dismantle public education want to dismantle the democracy.
Jennifer, I have a last question for you. We talked earlier about the significance of being a witness. We are all of us in this moment witnesses to this current moment. And I'm wondering if I asked you just to reflect on what you hope the listeners to this interview might take away. What do you hope that they will remember to witness and communicate forward that also makes you hopeful, not just for public education, but for our democracy as a whole?
I've been thinking about that a little bit lately. And one of the things I think about is when I read about these centers for deportation that they're building, those are institutions. And they're closed institutions. We don't know what's going on in there. And that's something to find out. We are witnessing this, but are we taking responsibility for it? Because we don't know who's in there. We hear little stories, bits and pieces, but there are children in these places, and they should be in public school so that we can care for them and teach them.
Jennifer, it has been absolutely terrific speaking with you. I appreciate your openness. I appreciate the depth of the stories that you shared. Thank you so much for being open to this conversation.
It was really wonderful. I really had a good time talking with you. Thank you.
My thanks again to Jennifer Hall-Lee, member of the Pasadena Unified School Board, for a really thoughtful and grounded conversation. You know, listening to Jennifer, what resonates deeply is that public education is not automatically self-sustaining. It depends on people choosing it and defending it, and sometimes standing alone for it before others are ready to join. Her story, and even her family's story, reminds us that progress in public life rarely arrives comfortably. It begins with someone willing to say, this is not acceptable, and also willing to witness the moment for the future so we can all learn from it. I am truly grateful for her willingness to share how she carries that legacy forward in the daily work of local governance in her community. Hey, if this conversation sparked an idea, raised a question, or got you thinking about your own leadership, I would love to hear from you. Call me at 602-688-2724 and leave a message. Ask a question, share a reflection, suggest a topic that you'd like to hear explored next. I listen to every message, and your input genuinely helps shape future episodes. And if you'd be open to sharing some of the hard-earned lessons from your own leadership journey, I invite you to apply to be a guest. You'll find the podcast guest link in the show notes. Your story may help another leader see their own work more clearly as they serve their own community. If you believe that our system of government depends on people staying in conversation, especially when it's hard, I invite you to join me on Substack. You'll find my column, Democracy Runs on Dialogue, linked in the program notes. Community Catalysts is edited by Nick Living the Dream Tantillo. Our executive producer is John Little. Happy birthday, John. I'm Matt Lehrman of Social Prosperity Partners. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with another Community Catalyst.